Committee on Homeland Security, Subcommittee on Transportation Security will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Micah, be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in this hearing. Without objection, so ordered. The subcommittee is meeting today to examine the Transportation Security Administration's management and implementation of the Screening Partnership Program. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's hearing to assess TSA's management and implementation of the Screening Partnership Program, or SPP for short. I'm pleased to have once again Jennifer Grover, the Director for Homeland Security and Justice for the Government Accountability Office, and Carolyn Dorgum, the SPP Director for TSA. And if that's not enough acronyms in one sentence, I don't know what is. There are witnesses for today's hearing. The hearing comes at a critical time for Homeland Security. Just before I came out, there was another incident on a jetliner where a woman tried to open up the back door of an airliner on the way to Boston. So it continues. As we all mourn the innocent victims of the horrific terrorist attacks in Paris, Egypt, and Lebanon, we must continue to pray for the victims' families and for all the first responders who put their own lives on the line every day. America and our allies must stand together to fight ISIS, their hateful ideology, and the violence it incites. As chairman of both the Foreign Fighter Task Force and this subcommittee, I am all too aware of the lengths to which ISIS will go to inflict terror. We must remain vigilant and recognize that ISIS is intent on inflicting harm on anyone who opposes their radical beliefs. As the story behind the Russian Metrojet plane unfolds, it is clear that the insider threat is real at airports. We must take steps to mitigate it both overseas and here at home. Earlier this month, the San Francisco Gate reported that 3 screeners at San Francisco Airport were arrested for taking money to allow drug smugglers to pass through security checkpoints with large amounts of cocaine in their baggage. In March, 2 other screeners at SFO were arrested and arraigned for taking bribes to allow smugglers to pass through checkpoints with methamphetamines. The SFO is one of 21 airports in the United States that participate in the Screening Partnership Program, where screening operations are run by a private contractor. But these cases are not limited to SFO or to the privatized screening workforce. In 2012, 4 TSA screeners colluded with smugglers to allow drugs through checkpoints at LAX in exchange for cash payments. When screeners are taking bribes and turning a blind eye, terrorists can easily exploit this vulnerability and create catastrophic consequences. I point to something that happened earlier this year where a drug smuggling case in Dallas-Fort Worth revealed the fact that the employees that were bringing the drugs through unmanned checkpoints or using their SIDA cards offered not only to take in drugs, but also offered to take in bombs. So a threat is real from both a screening standpoint and from the employee standpoint at airports. It's a systematic problem that we must deal with head-on, or it will only be a matter of time before we hear a story about a screener or aviation worker in the United States intentionally allowing explosives or weapons to pass through security checkpoints. TSA must step up its oversight of both the federal and private sector employees responsible for screening and other important jobs at our nation's airports. The stakes are simply too high not to do so. The Aviation and Transportation Security Act of 2001 required TSA to conduct a pilot program to evaluate the performance of private screening at airports. The pilot was conducted from 2002 to 2004 at 5 airports, including Rochester, New York, which is near my hometown of Syracuse. The 5 airports that participated in the pilot program transitioned to SPP, and since then, the number of airports participating in SPP has grown to 21. Whether they are federal workers or private contractors conducting screening at checkpoints, we must ensure that TSA is properly overseeing this workforce and guarding against potential threats, including those emanating from the screening workforce. We all want the best and most effective security safeguarding our nation's airports. It is also incumbent upon us to ensure that taxpayer money is being spent judiciously without sacrificing the scope or quality of security operations. However, without sufficient and reliable data from TSA, Congress is left to make important policy decisions based on assumptions rather than facts. This is not how we should be doing business. A lack of inadequate information exists to measure the success of SPP versus non-SPP screening operations almost 12 years after the implementation of the program. That is simply unacceptable. For over 6 years, GAO reports have highlighted a lack of sufficient and reliable data to compare private versus federal screener performance and cost for 6 years. Today, GAO will testify in yet another report that found while TSA has made improvements to their cost estimating calculations, there are still a number of shortcomings that need to be addressed. It concerns me that TSA has failed to adequately address this issue of a transparent and accurate cost assessment over 6 years after concerns were initially raised. Furthermore, the recent termination of a SPP contract agreement in western Montana only 1 year after the contract was awarded is troubling. It raises questions about how TSA is evaluating contractor applications prior to award and the management of the workforce transition from non-SPP to SPP. I look forward to hearing from the GAO on what can be done to address some of these critical information gaps, and I look forward to hearing from TSA on how they plan to address this issue in an effective and timely manner and once and for all. Again, thank you both for being here today. The chair now recognizes the ranking minority member of the subcommittee, the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Rice, for any statement she may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this hearing. I would also like to thank the witnesses for being here to discuss how the Transportation Security Administration is managing and executing the Screening Partnership Program, as well as the Government Accountability Office's most recent report regarding the program. After the attacks on September 11th, the Aviation and Transportation Security Act established the Transportation Security Administration as the federal entity responsible for transportation security and a federal screener workforce. This represented a pivot away from the pre-9/11 model, but it also included an amendment that led to the establishment of SPP, which gives airports the opportunity to opt out of federal screening and instead contract private companies to conduct security screening services under federal oversight. We often hear in Congress that screening without TSOs will lead to a more pleasant and expedient travel experience, but this is simply not the case. When an airport opts out of federal screening and begins to transition to private screeners, they recruit and, as we will hear today, in many cases depend on the retention of TSOs who are given the right of first refusal for these positions. The airports enforce the same policies and procedures, hoping to retain the same personnel, who are often forced to choose between accepting the same job with less benefits, relocating to continue working for TSA, or finding other jobs. To coincide with this hearing, GAO released a report that compares the costs incurred by TSA to perform screening to the costs associated with privatized screening. First, I believe that through this report, we will come to find that without certain changes, we cannot have a true comparison between the screening entities. I look forward to hearing Ms. Grover's testimony and thoughts on TSA's cost estimate methodology. Second, we have the example of 4 airports in Montana that opted out of federal screening, but ultimately terminated the contracts because the vendor couldn't attract or retain staff levels to perform screening duties. So while these airports opted for private screening, in many instances, they still had to rely on TSA's national deployment force to provide screening. That is obviously very concerning. I thank Ms. Dorgum for being here today, and I hope she will speak to those concerns and discuss the oversight that takes place at these airports that opt out of federal screening. I'm also eager to hear who pays for those TSA deployment forces and if those costs are included in TSA's cost estimates on the front end of the contracting process. Finally, before closing, I would like to acknowledge the horrific acts of terrorism that occurred in Paris on Friday. Those attacks, along with the explosion of a metro jet in Egypt, remind us that the threat of terrorism has not gone away. That threat is very real, it is constant, and it is always evolving. TSOs play a critical role in confronting that threat. They serve on the front line of our nation's airports, screening millions of passengers daily, and I thank them for working to keep the traveling public safe. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for convening this hearing. I look forward to a productive dialogue today, as well as the follow-up hearing scheduled for December, where we will be able to consider additional perspectives. I yield back the balance of my time.
Excuse me. Our first witness is Ms. Jennifer Grover, who currently serves as the Director of the Homeland Security and Justice Team at the Government Accountability Office. Her portfolio includes GAO reviews of TSA and the U.S. Coast Guard programs and operations. Ms. Grover joined the GAO in 1991. She has testified before this committee many times, and she's done a highly competent job, and we look forward to hearing your testimony again today. The chair now recognizes Ms. Grover to testify.
Good afternoon, Chairman Katko, Ranking Member Rice, and other members and staff. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss TSA's Screening Partnership Program today. My remarks are based on a GAO report being released today. Since SPP's inception, congressional committees, industry stakeholders, and TSA have all sought for information about how screening costs compare at airports with private and federal screeners. To answer this question, TSA prepares estimates of what it would cost the agency to provide screening services at the SPP airports. We found that TSA's cost estimating process has improved since our last review, in particular by providing a detailed methodology. However, important limitations still affect the reliability of TSA's estimates. For example, TSA's cost estimates are not complete because they only include the costs incurred by TSA to perform screening at an airport, and not total federal costs such as retirement benefits and insurance. We found that these other federal costs add another 9% on average to total screening costs for the 13 airports in our review. OMB guidance describes what should be included in estimates of government costs. In this case, as in others, including all federal costs would eliminate bias by ensuring that the estimated government screening costs are accurately represented and not systematically understated. TSA also uses a modified version of these cost estimates as part of their process for selecting SPP contractors. Specifically, the estimates serve as a cap to ensure that no SPP contracts are awarded for more than what it would cost TSA to provide screening services. We found that contract awards for 13 recent SPP airports ranged from 2 to 19% less than TSA's estimated costs, with an average savings of 11%. Now keep in mind my previous point that TSA's estimated costs are about 9% less than total estimated federal costs. Therefore, under this procurement process, the contract award value will always be no more than TSA's estimate and even lower than total estimated federal costs. Does this mean that SPP airports cost less to run than airports with federal screeners? We cannot answer that question because TSA does not continue to monitor the value of an SPP contract relative to TSA's estimated costs after the contract has been awarded. For example, although TSA monitors changes in the contractor cost over time, TSA doesn't update how its own estimated costs would change in response to new situations, such as providing additional staff if an airport opens a new terminal. Continually monitoring how actual contract values compare to updated estimates of TSA's costs would provide program officials and policymakers with more accurate information about the relative costs of operating airports with private and federal screeners. Finally, although congressional committees have sought information on the cost effectiveness of the SPP, we found that TSA has not regularly reported cost comparisons to policymakers. Since 2013, TSA has prepared comprehensive annual reports that include a comparison of actual private costs with estimated federal costs. According to TSA, they have not shared these reports with Congress because they're developed for internal use. We concluded that while TSA has no legal requirement to report this information, doing so, such as on an annual basis, would enable congressional committees to assess the effectiveness of the SPP program and its effect on federal costs. We've made several recommendations based on these findings: that TSA continue to improve its cost estimating methods, continually monitor how contract values compare to TSA's estimated costs, and provide cost comparisons to Congress on a regular basis. TSA concurred with all of our recommendations, and we will monitor TSA's progress toward their implementation. Chairman Katko, Ranking Member Rice, this concludes my remarks. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Grover, for your testimony. We definitely appreciate you being here today. Our second witness is Ms. Carolyn Dorgum, who currently serves as Director of the Screening Partnership Program at the Transportation Security Administration's Office of Security Administration. The Chair now recognizes Ms. Dorgum to testify.
Good afternoon, Chairman Katko, Ranking Member Rice, and members of the subcommittee. I am pleased to appear before you today to discuss the Transportation Security Administration's Screening Partnership Program, or SPP. The SPP is a voluntary program under which airports apply to transfer screening operations from federal to qualified private security screening companies. Upon an airport's acceptance into the program, TSA selects a company to conduct screening services under contract with the federal government. These companies must comply with all TSA security screening procedures, and TSA's federal security directors oversee these contracted operations to ensure compliance. TSA maintains its responsibility for security regardless of whether screening is conducted by private or federal employees. 21 airports are currently participating in the SPP, and 1 additional airport has been accepted into the program and is currently in the source selection phase. Current SPP airports screen approximately 32 million passengers per year, or 5% of the TSA annual passenger volume. The FAA Modernization and Reform Act of 2012 provided new requirements for the program, including standards for the SPP application, a timeline for agency action on applications, and steps TSA must take if denying an application. Since passage of the FAA Act, 7 airports have applied to the SPP program. All 7 airports were approved within the required 120 days, and 6 airports have private screeners in place today. The FAA Act also requires TSA to ensure that approving an airport operator's application would not compromise the security or detrimentally affect the cost efficiency or effectiveness of the screening of passengers or property at the airport. In order to maintain cost efficiency as required by law, TSA includes the TSA cost estimate in all requests for proposal and requires that cost proposals not exceed the TSA cost estimate. All offerers are evaluated on proposed costs, as well as their ability to perform screening according to TSA standards. GAO recently completed an audit focused on TSA's cost estimates. TSA is pleased that GAO recognized the improvements in our cost methodology. TSA concurs with all 3 of GAO's recommendations and has already taken steps to address them. Our Office of Finance and Administration is working to implement adjustments to our cost estimating methodology based on GAO's recommendations. My office will include the cost comparison information in our semi-annual Screening Partnership Program report to Congress so that our oversight committees have visibility on our estimates and program figures. Finally, TSA will compare on an annual basis the actual contract expenditures for a given airport to TSA's estimate for screening with federal officers. If an airport's SPP application meets all legal requirements and a qualified contractor is identified during the procurement process, TSA's goal for the SPP program is to award a contract within 1 year of receiving the application. Compared to federal contracting practices, this is an aggressive goal. However, it reflects TSA's commitment to ensuring that airports opting for contract screeners can expeditiously transition from federal to contract screening operations. Additionally, TSA recently began changing its SPP contracting approach. Rather than awarding individual contracts, we are now working to award an indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity, or IDIQ contract. Awarding the IDIQ will provide a pool of highly qualified vendors that are capable of running screening operations in a cost-efficient manner, not detrimental to security per statutory requirements. Successful offerers will then be able to compete for security screening services at specific airports through task orders. This new approach is expected to reduce procurement timelines for TSA while simultaneously streamlining the proposal process for industry. TSA provides information to vendors interested in participating through numerous resources. TSA utilizes the Federal Business Opportunities website to communicate with vendors on SPP-related topics, such as annual Industry Day opportunities at TSA headquarters and posting draft statements of work and requests for proposals that solicit vendor feedback. Additionally, TSA provides opportunities for industry days at airports, which allow vendors to tour the airport, ask airport-specific questions concerning, for example, equipment requirements and airport layout. TSA also meets with vendors in other forums, such as summits and roundtable discussions. My responsibility as the senior executive responsible for the SPP is to focus on its security, effectiveness, and efficiency. I work to achieve transparency and engagement with industry so that our qualified private partners have access to information that helps them achieve these same goals. I appreciate this committee's interest in the success of the program. Chairman Katko, Ranking Member Rice, members of the committee, thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Dorgan, for your testimony, and we appreciate you taking the time to be here. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions, so let's get right at it. In 2009 and 2011, GAO did reports, am I correct on this matter? And in both reports, they noticed and they noted strongly that TSA's cost estimates were not properly taking into account some other costs associated with having the screeners. So until you have an appropriate cost estimate for both the private screeners as well as the TSA screeners, you can't do a really good comparison because there's really two components. One is a cost estimate and one is a performance estimate. And those two have to be considered, they're intertwined. So with that as a background, does TSA have internal figures at their disposal that give a true cost estimate for the screeners that work for TSA?
So what I would like to clarify is that the TSA cost estimate that is being published as part of the RFP reflects TSA's actual costs for screening at that airport. It does not include long-term retirement benefits because those are not included in TSA's annual appropriations, so we would have to absorb that difference in cost, the 9% difference in cost that GAO outlined in their report, by reducing funds somewhere else, in another security program, for instance, which could be detrimental to security, and it also would be creating a cost inefficiency because now we would be spending more on SPP screening at an airport than we would with TSA screeners. So this is the reason why it is not in the TSA cost estimate. From a cost comparison perspective, we don't see any challenge with putting including the long-term retirement costs for cost comparison purposes.
Okay, well, now I'm not an accountant, but that is a cost attributed. There is a cost attributed with each employee that's a screener at TSA for retirement, just like there's a cost estimate for people in the SPP program for the private entities, whether or not they have retirement and all that is part of their cost estimate. So how can we do a accurate cost comparison if you're not giving accurate figures? Now, we're not telling you have to shift funds or do whatever. We're just saying from a simple arithmetic standpoint, and I'm not an accountant, but it seems pretty straight to me that you just we've asked you since 2009 for the cost estimates associated per employee at TSA, and you're telling me that 9% is the additional cost, correct? That is part of the cost for TSA screeners?
The 9% is their long-term retirement benefits.
And it is a cost?
It is a cost.
Okay. So that's a cost. We got that. Now, on top of that, is there other federal agencies or other federal entities that cause additional costs to be on top of what we've already talked about here? So you got which a published cost, plus a 9% for retirement costs. Is there more that other agencies incur in dealing with this program?
So, no, sir, the 9% is the other federal cost that other federal agencies incur in long-term retirement benefits. The benefits that TSA provides its employees, its federal screeners, when they are on federal payroll, we pass on to the vendors as part of the TSA cost estimate.
Okay. Now, Ms. Grover, you mentioned that there's an average savings of 11% for having the, for the private screeners, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Does that include the 9% that we're talking about, or?
No, sir.
No, okay, so is that on, is that something you should add on to that 11% cost savings figure?
Well, to be clear, our recommendation was that TSA should be sure to include all federal costs for the purposes of the cost estimate comparison, as you were mentioning in your statement earlier, because it's critically important to understand an accurate apples-to-apples comparison of what it costs to provide screening services under the two scenarios. But for the purposes of procurement, that's an entirely different matter. TSA has a great deal of discretion under federal acquisition regulations, and setting the cap at TSA costs is certainly consistent with the FAR. And the other thing I would point out is that the fact that there have been multiple bids at that level and that most contracts have been carried out successfully suggests that TSA is able to successfully compete contracts at the level of the TSA cap.
Okay, so is the only thing that's missing from the cost estimate this 9% retirement cost, is there something else that's missing?
It's retirement costs, it's liability insurance, and a little bit of foregone corporate tax revenues, but it adds up together to about 9% on average for the 13 airports that we looked at. So there could be some variation if you look more broadly at other airports. But yeah, that's about it.
Okay, so okay, all right. Well, I can keep going on this, but I don't want to get too far over, so Ms. Rice, you're up next.
So it seems to me that the two main areas of concern when we're talking about screening and airport security are safety, right? The quality of the screening process, and the cost to the American taxpayer to ensure that we have a quality screening process. Would you both agree?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes.
And I think that regardless of what side of the aisle you're on, you can't put a dollar amount on quality screening and safety in the aviation industry here in this country, especially in light of what happened 2 weeks ago. Would you all agree?
Yes.
So is it accurate to say that those airports who have decided to go into the SPP and opt out and use private individuals, right, that they are relying on the TSOs who have been trained through their employment with the TSA? Is that true?
So I can answer that question. TSA provides the training. TSA bears program cost. We provide the equipment and the standard operating procedures. The private screener workforce works for a qualified private company. So they are not TSA employees,
Right.
but they are trained in
by
the same
TSA.
manner.
Right. So I guess my question is the biggest disparity between the different, either the TSA doing the screening or airports opting to do it, opting out, right, is a benefit cost, right? Wages, benefits cost?
So approximately, based on our cost estimates, 76 to 85% of the overall TSA cost estimate is indirect wages and benefits and the like. The remaining percentage is only for activities such as facilities, supplies, and other costs.
So the majority is the difference in wages?
Correct.
Okay. And would you both agree that there is a morale issue at TSA right now?
The recent morale results for all of DHS are low, and TSA is low within DHS, yes.
And so paying people less who are in a position where they are literally securing the safety of other human beings might not be a good morale booster. Is that
If
correct?
I could just clarify, the private contractors are required to pay their screeners with compensation and benefits that is not less than what the federal screeners receive.
So then, just before you said that there was a disparity in the benefits and the wages?
So sometimes it may appear as if there is a disparity because what we do or what we've historically done under ATSA, we establish wage rates for every screening category. And we pass that hourly wage rate, which is a composite of direct wage and fringe benefits, to the contractor or to the vendor. Sometimes, as long as the vendor meets this composite number, we're good with that. We consider them compliant. So one vendor may give their employees more direct pay than fringe benefits or vice versa. So it may appear as if their benefits or their wages are being cut when in reality they're still receiving the same hourly wages. It's just a different distribution between direct pay and benefits. There is a second scenario where it may have the appearance as if the vendor is not passing on those benefits, is if the vendor, even though they're paying the same cost that the federal government incurs for a specific package, is not able to secure the same benefits. But this is how it appears as if they're not receiving the same wages.
Okay. And now the contract to the vendor in Montana was terminated apparently due to staffing issues. Is that correct? Where the TSOs declined to stay on with the private vendor in Montana? Is that
the vendor in Montana was terminated because of their inability to conduct the screening of passengers and baggage as outlined under the terms and conditions of their contract, not necessarily just the staffing aspect.
Okay.
The staffing issue just compounded the problem.
So has there been a study done to see what the difference is in terms of actual airport security between these two different operations?
In 2012, GAO issued a report where we did a review of the performance at SPP airports and airports with federal screeners. And in general, we found that the performance was about the same. In some areas, the federal screeners did better. On some other different TSA tests, the SPP screeners did better, but it wasn't any significant, overwhelming difference in one direction or another. So I'd say for security effectiveness, performance seems to be about the same.
And TSA, obviously, in both scenarios, oversees
Correct.
the implementation. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Rogers for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Ms. Rice. We want to make sure that we have safe and secure passenger screening. So it's obvious from the testimony we've had that there's no discernible difference in the quality of screening. The private contractors have to pay at least as much as the government contractors. So, Ms. Dorgan, why do you continue to drag your feet on getting accurate cost estimates when this has been brought to your attention in 2009 and again since then, and not provide the documentation that GAO says that you should provide?
So the good news is since 2012, with the passage of the FAA Modernization and Reform Act, we have made significant progress in improving our cost estimating methodology. We have concurred with GAO's recommendations, and we will, on an annual basis, start comparing the cost of federal screening to the cost of private screening, and provide those numbers in our semi-annual report to oversight committees so that lawmakers can get a better understanding of the cost.
I don't understand. This is not rocket science. They've told you in 2009 what was deficient about your cost estimate analysis and processes. Why couldn't you provide it before 2010, much less here we are in 2015? I don't understand. Ms. Grover just outlined the areas that were deficient. You said you agreed with them. Why does it take this long? Why hasn't it been done already? Do you not want the information to be out there?
No, sir, we do have the information. We just didn't have a process for the comparison.
You didn't realize that benefits had to be calculated into it?
Well, we will comply with the recommendations, and I believe there was a misunderstanding in that the original requests were to include those benefits that TSA does not get as part of the appropriation in our actual estimate that we pass on and use as the ceiling contract. But there is no issue at all with using those for comparison purposes.
I think any reasonable person knows that in order to get an accurate cost comparison, you have to factor in those costs. Ms. Grover, in the 2009 study, did y'all make the suggestion that those benefits had to be included in the cost estimate analysis?
Yes, sir.
And did y'all also recommend at that time that this needed to be a continued review to be able to get a long-term comparison?
No, sir, we didn't.
So that is a new recommendation.
Yes, sir, that's new, and it's particularly important given the new information about the discrepancies between the TSA estimated costs and the award values, because it's through the ongoing updates of TSA's estimated costs that they will be able to determine whether there are differences in costs over the long term.
Good. And Ms. Dorgan, you already testified you intend to comply. You agree with these recommendations and you intend to comply.
We agree, sir, yes.
So when will you be able to implement these new methodologies so that we will have the more accurate information?
We have already started making the changes to the cost methodology that we currently, that was under review by GAO. We will provide in our next semi-annual report, mid-2016, the first cost comparison information to Congress. There are multiple contracts that expire at different times. So by providing 2 reports a year, you will be able to see the cost comparisons on all contracts, regardless of when they expire.
Ms. Grover, is that the earliest that should be expected?
I think that sounds like a reasonable time frame, sir.
Okay. Ms. Dorgan, do you have a bias against SPP programs?
I do not, sir.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Micah for 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I think the Ranking Member, when she started, said there's 2 things that we want to determine here. One is performance. We've got to make certain that we've got the best performing screening process and security process out there. And then secondly, cost. That's what this is about. Unfortunately, TSA has done everything they can to thwart the private screening. Let's go back to performance. In 2012, you just said that basically looking at the 2 performance, and they were basically about equal. Isn't that correct in performance?
Yes, sir, that's what we found.
And we found that too. Now, let me say that at the end of when I was involved in setting this up, and we finished you testified about the finishing after we had set up 5 airports with private screening under federal supervision. It was San Francisco, Rochester, Tupelo, Kansas City, and the smallest one was Jackson Hole, Wyoming, which actually the airport does its own screening. We tested them after having them in operation. That was at the end of that period. The report I got back, which was a classified report at the time, said that private screening under federal supervision performs statistically significantly better, okay? And I've assumed that from the beginning. I've sat in on numerous classified reports. We've seen some leaks about performance. In 2007, we had 30,000 screeners, and the leak was 75% failure rate. That's anecdotal from the press. Just recently, we saw with 46,000 screeners reported in the press a failure rate of 95%. Some of you may have read that. So we have 46,000 screeners versus 30, and we've actually gotten worse in performance, which has been leaked. Okay. Now, were you involved in the Sanford request for privatization, Orlando Sanford Airport, ma'am?
I was not, sir.
It was not. I'd love to have as a witness the former director who requested in 2010 for private screening. TSA sent their goons down and intimidated this airport director, and they've done that around the country to keep them from applying. And he told me the pressure that was exerted. That's why I went back in 2012 and we changed the rules for this. From 2012, when we passed the law at the end of the FAA bill, to 2014, how many private applications did you approve?
7.
No, you approved none. 2012 to just the beginning of, the end of 2013.
So
There were none. I had you in the office. It took you 2 years to come up with this. You dragged your feet in the evaluation process and coming up with the terms. I can tell you, you had none. I threw TSA out of the office when they told me that, and I'll be glad to document that. The whole point is we have limited resources, and every study we've had, we just had, I have TSA oversight and my transportation subcommittee assignment. We just had a hearing at the full committee level, and the IG and GAO came in and said almost every area TSA is failing. Every area, every layer. That's what they testified to us. They've built a huge bureaucracy. Do you still have 4,000 people around Washington, D.C., making on average $103,000 apiece?
I don't have that information.
Yeah, I'm telling
sir.
you, it's close to that, unless you move some people into other agencies to try to camouflage the figures. They have close to 15,000 administrative personnel in TSA. Did you know that? What I'm talking about is getting the resources directed to where they should be. Private screening can be done. Didn't you just testify that it can be done anywhere from 2 to 19% cheaper? Ms. Grover? Just tell us the figures for the record one more time.
Yeah, 11% difference on
On
average
average.
at the time of award.
Yeah.
So the question is still open about whether that will actually play out over
It's
the
not
5
done
years.
at any cheaper wages or benefits. That's all baloney, okay? Because we require that. We require the standards. And we've looked at the airports and their performance. You should see the report we did on San Francisco, which is private, and Los Angeles. In recruitment, in training, and management, and every category, it costs more, and TSA did an inept job at it. And to support the thousands you've got here in Washington and across the country in supporting this huge personnel bureaucracy is not directing the resources towards what we need to do, is go after people who pose a risk. So we're one of a few countries in the world, in the Western hemisphere, or in the Western world, not just hemisphere, Western world, that employs an all-federal operation where you do everything and none of it's done well. So my point here today is making SPP work. It can work. We can use our resources and put them. Right now it should be intelligence, 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 connecting the dots, connecting the dots. TSA has failed almost every time in connecting the dots, and Homeland Security reports have verified that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm ready for a second round when you...
Thank you, Mr. Micah. Yes, I think, I know we have votes coming up, but let's try and just honor a couple minutes per questioning for this round, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll go from there. And I have a couple of follow-up questions. First of all, with Ms. Grover, when in your reports, did you find that there was a problem with the bid, the way the private contractors' bids were being treated for the starting rates for the people that they were going to employ? It seems to be some disparity between that and what's going on with TSA and how they pay their employees.
No, sir. No necessarily problem with that. Just note that TSA is moving towards a wage requirement change, where in the future there would be a comparison between the wage that would be calculated under the ATSA wage rate compared to the services contract wage rate, and then the contractor would be required to pay whichever is higher.
In doing your evaluation, did you do anything, did you encounter any issues with respect to the ability of employees at TSA versus SPP employees to have flexibility to make modifications in the way they were doing their business? I mean, who was more, was there one that was better at doing that than the other? Like maybe making modifications to how employees are handled or modifications to security procedures? And if so, which one was seemed to be more efficient?
You know, the approach to security procedures should be exactly the same because the SPP screeners are required to follow the TSA's SOPs, use the same equipment, and so on. The reason airports select SPP is because they often believe that they have prospects for better customer service. So we don't know very much about that. TSA has a test that they use called PACE, which looks at some aspects of customer service. But I don't believe that there is a record of complaints for SPP airports versus federal airports that would really illuminate that.
Now, if I understand the testimony correctly from both of you, there's not a discernible difference really in the performance of the SPP screeners versus the TSA screeners. Is that basically correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, and if that is the case, and we're in this era of trying to save as much money as we can for the government and trying to make our government agencies as efficient as possible, do you, either one of you have an opinion if, based on the cost estimates, which one is, would be more cost efficient to use? Ms. Grover, you can go first, please.
Well, in our report, we noted that with an 11% difference at the time of contract award, that it certainly raises questions about whether screening can be operated at less expense with private screeners. But that question has not been answered yet because it would have to be monitored over the life of the contract.
Okay. And Ms. Dorgum?
I agree with Ms. Grover's assessment. We would have to wait for the life cycle of the contract to be over and compare every year both the federal and the private screening costs to be able to come to a definite conclusion. Because if we look at the sample under study, it was 13 airports out of the 21 that we currently have. So that is only 8.7% of the SPP airports, and it's 0.4 or 5% of the overall TSA volume that we process. So it is statistically a small sample, but it would help if we allow the life cycle of the contract to conclude before we make any other conclusions. So I am hesitant to say it is more cost efficient just because of the sample size.
So how long do you think it would take to get for the life of the contract? How long are these contracts?
So it's a 1-year base contract and 4 option years. Most of our contracts were awarded either last year or the year before. So we would be looking at 4 years.
Is that accurate, Ms. Grover?
Well, with every year, you'll have additional information.
Correct. Correct. I'm not sure we have to wait
So
5 years for that. But we do need a base sample. And we can't get the base sample until we get the actual correct cost figures from TSA as to what the costs are for a TSA screener versus a SPP screener. Is that right?
Well, I would look at it a little differently. I would look at it as 2 separate issues. Because on the one hand, you want to have an understanding of the cost comparison, but you already have what you need to begin looking at, because the contractors are actively bidding on these contracts with the cap at TSA's costs. So that's a live concern already, and you already have what you need to begin monitoring that right now.
Okay. Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Rice for questioning.
But are you comparing apples to apples in that scenario? Because it doesn't seem like you are.
So the contractors, so right, but it's a question of what are the contractors willing to accept to do that work? And then you're right, if you wanted to understand what would be the total cost to the federal government at those airports, then you would need to have the total cost. Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
Right, so we shouldn't sit here and act like these are accurate apples to apples, oranges to oranges comparisons, because that really hinders us from getting to the heart of the issue, in my opinion. And I'd just like to talk about, comment on what Mr. Michael was talking about in terms of there needing to be a focus now on intelligence. He said it 3 times, intelligence, 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 there he is. And I couldn't agree more. And I think there was widespread agreement across the aisle post 9/11 that we wanted the federal government to be responsible for screening at our airports given the tragedies of 9/11. Unfortunately for the TSA, they were never empowered appropriately. So they are not, for instance, seen as a law enforcement agency and are not privy to a lot of the intelligence that other law enforcement agencies within the federal government are. So I think that if you want to talk about privatization, that's a great conversation to have, but I think that we should look at the way that we have hamstrung the TSA from the very beginning, from its very inception, and really never allowed it to do what we needed it to do, which is all the explanation you need as to why the morale is so poor. So I think we just need to have, stop politicizing this and say it's either, you know, too much government, we've got to privatize this. The federal government, you know, if everything that's been happening over the last 2 weeks in the world is any indication, we have to put more resources and a higher premium on security of the homeland. And you know, talking about these numbers when you're not talking about apples to apples comparisons as a justification for privatization is not really a conversation that, you know, is appropriate. That's all. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Micah, you recognized for a few more moments of questioning, if you so choose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, if you could, this is 2013, July 1st. The headline says, Micah, TSA cooked the books to inflate screening costs. If you could put this article in the record, I think it would be appropriate at this juncture.
Without objection, so ordered.
Okay. And again, this just goes on and on about playing with these figures, but unfortunately, it requires huge number of personnel to operate TSA with an all-federal force. Thousands in Washington, 10,000 out in the field. And what I'd like to do is get TSA out of that business. The private sector can screen, and they do it well. They perform even better. I'm absolutely convinced on the covert screening that I've seen and the reports I've had back. So it costs less. The other thing, too, is redirecting our resources. You've got thousands of people here in Washington, right, ma'am? You have thousands of people here. We've got the reports. You could just, yeah, you can agree with me.
So I don't have the exact number. I apologize.
How many are in your program, in the private screening program?
14 people, including myself.
14 people. That is a huge bureaucracy. But you see how few it takes to operate that? Even dragging your feet. So now, again, what I'd like to do is redirect those personnel and those dollars, connecting the dots. TSA needs to be in the security business and government responsibility. We are going to lose this effort if we continue to put the money into a huge bureaucracy. You still will screen under federal government will conduct the audits, set the rules, the regulations, like you do. Isn't that what you do now? You set everything, right, for the private screeners?
So the role of the
you set the standards, right?
We do set the standards.
And the benefits and the pay and everything else is set at one level. Isn't that right, Ms. Grover?
Yes, sir,
Okay.
TSA.
It is. No one's trying to do anything less, but what you do is you get rid of the bureaucracy. At Rochester, which is a private airport under federal supervision, how many personnel, TSA people, do you have there? I can tell you, at one time you had 18, many of them making between 80 and 100,000 to pack the books because you had a private screening operation. I went to Canada and saw they had one federal TSA equivalent in oversight position, which we should have at the airport. But you pad the cost, You had 80 at San Francisco. Some were needed on international work and other work, which could also be assigned to private screeners, while you get in the security business, finding out who the hell poses a risk. You don't even have your watch lists and your other things so that we can identify people totally coordinated. Are you aware of that, ma'am? I mean, you probably are. You do run the SPP program.
So
But that's where
what
the
I-
resources need to be, or they will get us. You need to be vetting your personnel. We've got report after report, the ones that were just released. They are not vetting their people. They hired people in my district that my sheriff fired, and they were hired as TSA people, and my sheriff was appalled at what they were doing, hiring people that shouldn't be working at an airport. Vetting airport workers. We're going to see what happened in Metrojet, if that was an inside job. We have to, the people who are working at our airports need to be closely vetted. That's a government responsibility. But you need to get out of this Mickey Mouse business, let someone else do the screening, set the standards, conduct the audits, and then get into the government security business and connect the dots. I'm sorry, you're probably doing the best you can with the position you have. I don't mean to pick on you. Thank you for your report and the update of their cooking the books. And this goes on and on and on, a year from now, 4 years from now. But nobody wants to change it. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I think that there is a desire to change it, and that's why we're having this hearing today. And we're going to be having a follow-up hearing in January with some other people that come testify before the committee, those being namely some from the private sector as well. Is that anybody else? Or? And what? And then the union representatives as well, so we can hear from their side of the story too. But as I understand it now, we're really not too far apart from getting what we need for points of comparison, that being the accurate cost estimates, and we're going to have those within 6 months when your next report is issued, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and then we're going to have, at least within a year at the latest, a pretty darn good idea of a one-year cycle on a contract of comparisons as well. So we're going to be able to really use that time to really do our homework. And I asked Ms. Grover to do that, and Ms. Dorgum as well. And you're not on opposite sides of the fence. Perhaps you can work together on this and give an accurate thing. Because what we basically want to do is have TSA be the best it can be, whatever iteration that is. And we can't do it unless we have the accurate comparisons. We need to do that. And so I appreciate that. And I am not going to tolerate any more delays in getting the accurate cost estimates. So. Now, Ms. Jackson Lee came in. They just called votes, so we're going to have about 5 minutes. But if we can recognize you for 5 minutes of testimony, if that's okay, ma'am. Well, I know that you are a very hard worker, so I have no problem with that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the ranking member as well. Let me say that I'll try to be pointed on the issue. I think this is an important issue, Mr. Chairman. But as you well know, we've experienced enormous tragedy in Paris, France. And part of the discussion, though it was not train-related, is the idea of screening, whether it is dealing with borders, dealing with transportation facilities. And so I'm going to just raise a question of concern, Mr. Chairman, that may have been at another hearing, but I think it is timely. And let me thank the witnesses for your presence here. I think it is timely with respect to the employees of airports, which I understand even now, I've chaired this committee before, that there is a different process. There was not screening, there was badging. And I would like to know, have we moved to the system of having the employees to be able to go through screening, or are they able to enter an airport by way of the apron, tarmac, ID being shown, and just immediately being able to go on the tarmac and enter from the backside, which I call the apron of the airport?
So I'm not completely certain as to what we're doing in that regard. From an SPP contractual perspective, all private screeners have to be vetted, just like their federal counterparts. They go through watch list matching and criminal background histories. We also conduct recurrent screening for them. Additionally, they're supposed to notify TSA immediately if there's any summons to court or if there is any arrest or any misconduct allegation. And the vendors have been very good at keeping us informed in that regard. So they are vetted exactly like the federal employees are vetted at the airport.
But they are still vetted separately in a different process or under a different operation than those at the airport. Is that correct? Even though you
yes.
say they're the same, but they are still under a different process, meaning they screen somewhere else.
I'm not familiar with the airport's vetting process. From a TSA perspective, any contractor that is under contract, any employee under contract with TSA receives the same vetting as the federal employees at that airport.
So at that airport, they go through the same exact screening?
Correct.
Okay. Am I able to get from, I think, Ms. Grover, an answer to my question about the knowledge of what you do with the individual worker that's coming through TSA screening? Are all workers screened, regardless of where they might be posted in the airport, or is there a limitation? And I'm sensing that they are not all screened. So if I'm working on the backside, the apron of the airport, am I just showing an ID and going through? Now, I realize that you make the point that anyone working the airport is already vetted. And I raise this question on 2 points. I raise this question clearly in the backdrop of Paris. Again, I make it very clear that I know these were not transit related. These were large venue related. These were people related. This was a heinous tragedy. But since we know that the mode of transportation modes are still the most attractive form of potential terrorism, as my time runs out, do we have an understanding of what happens on the backside of the airport? And then let me just refer you to a situation in Atlanta where there was gun trafficking, and that is because workers were able to come on with a badge and not go through TSA screening. Can you comment on that, please?
So, ma'am,
No, I'm asking, am I asking the wrong, Ms. Grover, I'm asking you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
I do not believe that all airport workers are screened at all checkpoints. I do know that TSA is making changes this year to reduce the number of employee access points and to increase the frequency of random screening. But with respect to your specific question about employees working in the back parts of the airport,
Right.
they would have limited access to certain areas of the airport, and they wouldn't be able to access other areas without getting specific permission or being escorted. But beyond that, I would have to go
No.
back and do some additional research for you.
And the chairman has been kind. Let me finish on this and pursue this later, Mr. Chairman. What I am saying that they can access the backside. I'm not interested, and I shouldn't say I'm not interested, but I'm not directing my questions to the point of whether or not they can be on the backside and then get to a lunch counter somewhere. I'm interested in whether they're on the backside with just showing their ID and coming on, because if they're just showing their ID, they could have anything on their person that could be a dangerous contributor to terrorism on the backside of the airplane, the airport, which is where airplanes are.
If I may add to that, we've had substantial hearings on this very issue, the employee access controls, and it was a genesis of the Employee Access Control Act that passed the House and is now sitting in the Senate, hopefully going to pick up steam after what happened in Paris. But the fact remains, it's an absolute fact that employees get much less screening at airports than travelers do. And it's an absolute fact that the vast majority of times, employees, once they get assigned a badge, have access to secure areas of airports without additional screening. That is just a fact.
And I'll end on that note. Did you have a response?
I would be happy to go back and get you that information, but I do not have anything to add to the conversation because I'm not really clear on what is being done in that regard. Employee vetting is not under my purview, but I'd be happy to get back with an answer.
Ms. Grover, GAO?
No, ma'am, nothing to add. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you, and I would just make the point that the bill is making its way through the Congress, I think we have a new sensitivity and cause for urgency in light of what we're seeing and the creativity of a new form of terrorism. And I say that it is scattered, it is unpredictable, which is what terrorism is, but it causes us to push on every aspect of security. I thank you for allowing me to sit on this.
Well, I thank you for your hard work in the Homeland Security Committee. There's no doubt that you work hard and you care, and I couldn't possibly agree with you more. We're in a different state. As we're sitting here today during this hearing, I just got word of another vehicle laden with bombs found outside the soccer stadium in Germany 2 hours before the match. So the terror continues, the terror is increasing, and it's clear that we have to step up our game. And I agree with you about the employee access bill, not just because I wrote it, but because we have to plug that security gap. And we have to continue to be vigilant. Homeland Security is at the forefront of fighting the war on terror. And whether we like it or not, we don't have the luxury of time, and we need to move.
I'm glad to have a fellow traveler, and this is a great committee. And I also want to say to the witnesses, we look forward to working with the administration. I know they are dedicated and committed to protecting the American people. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
All right, thank you. And I want to thank the witnesses. It's not always pleasant having to testify and take the fire for your agency, but you know that comes with the territory, and you know that when you sign up. And I've been on that end as a prosecutor many a time, and I'm on that end sometimes here. But it doesn't mean that we're in any way diminishing the good work you do for our country, and we know you have the best intentions at heart, so we thank you for your testimony. And I want to thank both witnesses for their testimony and members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7E, the hearing will be open for 10 days. I will say that I hope that we get all the information we need within the next 6 months. We can put this issue to rest and to make an educated decision on which way to go, if at all. If there's anything else you would like to offer, please do so in writing. We're going to have some additional questions for you that we're going to submit to both of you when asked you to respond in a timely manner. And without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you both very much.